Okay, so again, welcome everyone. The purpose of the Software Preservation Quarterly Community Forum is to bring together colleagues across professional and disciplinary communities to participate in this hour-long discussion on just various topics related to software curation, preservation, and reuse. We would remind you all to please fill out the Google form. We usually ask about a month out or 3 weeks out of each forum for topics. Today we're going to do some structured brainstorming with everyone on the call. It'll only take us about 6 minutes. Very informal. I'll walk y'all through that, but we're going to try to get some topics or suggested speakers from all of you today during the call. Just housekeeping reminder that this is being recorded. We ask that our speakers, they'll either be screen sharing or they will be they'll have their webcam on so that you all can see their smiling faces. So we would ask that again, everyone else mute and turn off your video. That just helps to reserve bandwidth and sound quality of the recording. And these AV recordings, we have them for all past forums. They haven't all made their way to the website yet, but we have an ongoing pipeline of spin recordings that we will put up on the YouTube channel and eventually embed them all in the website. If anyone has a request, however, for the MP4 file before it's available on the website, we are happy to oblige. And we may just send the direct link for the MP4 file out to the spin list. So with that, I'll just say that we're going to start again with this structured brainstorming. I'm going to time everyone on the call. This is very informal. So I would ask that you use a separate thing like Notepad, just a simple TXT editor, you know, no big deal if you have that on your computer, or like a Post-it note on your device. You could even jot them down on hand and then, you know, send them in later if you want. But I ask that you don't copy and paste them directly into the meeting notes document until the end of time being called. So yeah, and Hannah's reminding everyone, if you're not already on the public spin list, you can join. She put the bit.ly into the chat, and that's how you'll get all of the outputs from these quarterly community forums. So starting with 2 minutes, I'm going to press time, then I'll ask you all to think about topics or projects that you're aware of that you'd like to hear about at the next forum. And then once I call time, I'll ask y'all if you have it available in digital format to pop it right into the meeting notes document. If you don't have that available, it's perfectly fine. You can pop it into the chat. So with that, I'm going to start 2 minutes timed and go. You've got about 1 minute and 10 seconds. You've got about 40 seconds left. About 15 more seconds. And time, everyone. Perfect. If you haven't already popped your idea into the chat or the meeting notes document, I would ask you all to copy and paste that in now. In either spot is fine, whatever is easiest for you. And while we do that, I'm going to go ahead and read our next prompt. These are specific people. So maybe these are people that have a particular research agenda that is informed by or informs the work of software curation, archiving, and preservation or reuse. It could be people that develop software that you feel like it's really important to invite them to come and talk about the significance of their work. So just people in general, if you're thinking about individuals. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to have 2 more minutes. And then for the last one, upcoming events you want people to know about. We're not going to time that one. We're going to move on to our first speaker, but I would ask that for the remainder of today's call that y'all think about that. And if you think of an event that you want to share, you think the community should be aware of, then please do put it in there. So 2 minutes. Specific people, and go. Okay, y'all have about 1 more minute left. About 30 seconds. And time. All right, everyone. So if you had the opportunity to jot that down on your own personal notepad, whether that's digital or analog, please feel free to send them along, to copy them into the chat, or to put them directly into the running notes document. Thank you so much for your suggestions. This is going to be our menu, our game plan for our fall community forum. So we'll be working on the suggestions that you've made here today. And you can also feel free to go back if you think of something later on in the call and add it under either one of those prompts. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest today, starting with Marijn Grumpeter. She is a software engineer and metadata specialist for Software Heritage, which is just an amazing initiative that is based out of the INRIA Research Center in Paris. And she'll be talking about some of the things you see listed here, persistent identifiers, etc., in more detail, which we're very excited to learn about. But before she gets started, I just want to encourage you all to be thinking while she's talking any questions that you have. And I'll say this again later, don't be shy in reaching out to our speakers here today, you know, offline, off the call. They'll provide their Twitter handle and contact information. So feel free to ask questions. So Marijn, take it away.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Jessica, for this lovely presentation. I'm going to share my screen, and start my presentation. So I don't know if everyone here has heard about software heritage, but before I will dive into the subject for the agenda, I will also talk about the software heritage project. Then I will try to explain our data model for the archive and show you the persistent identifier schema we have. And then we'll go to the demonstration, for which I will show you our newest features. So the Software Heritage Project is a very ambitious project. We are trying to build the largest software source code archive in existence, and our main focus is collecting and preserving the software source code, not the software executables. Even if we found them, sometimes we preserve the executable as well, but the focus is source code, and of course sharing the source code we have. This is to become a reference catalog for all the source code, which is distributed on different forgers, but here it's archived so that we can know that it's preserved for eternity, or at least until software heritage is here. And it is the base for a research infrastructure on which we can enable an analysis of the source code on our infrastructure. We cater different actors, for actors from cultural heritage to industry actors. We also started some very interesting work for research about software citation and referencing, and research software, and also in education. Today we have a very large archive. We don't archive everything yet because there's very lot of work to do to have everything, but now we have more than 5 billion source code files, more than 1 billion commits, and more than 86 million repositories, which here are projects. We have a lot of support for our work, but not which is great. The INRIES Research Center is giving our location, and the UNESCO is a very big support. We have important sponsors that make this work possible, and many actors that share our vision. Now to the data model and to the persistent and identifiers part. First, before I will show you the model, I want to give a distinction between two types of identifiers, the DIOs versus the IDOs. The DIO is a digital identifier for potentially a non-digital object. It can be a physical object, or it can be like a project, an idea or a concept that is not digital. Even a team of development, a development team can be identified but is not digital, whereas a digital object is what we archive. So we try to search for identifier schema that is completely appropriate for digital object, that can provide integrity and that doesn't need a middleman, and it can be used, it is used now broadly in modern software development. So we try to provide, and we are providing, an intrinsic identifier for all our archived artifacts. The archived artifacts are very interesting because there are different levels of granularity. First, we have from top to bottom, we have the origin. The origin is the repository or the source where we found the artifacts. At a certain visit, we take a snapshot of this location, And at this location, we can gather a multitude of artifacts in a single snapshot. It can have different branches, like a branch that is in development and the headmaster branch. It can have branches that are identified by a tag, a certain tag, like a version number. Then if I use my mouse, I can show you how it goes. If we go and follow the occurrence of a tag, of a release, we go and identify a release, which is pointing to a revision, a commit, and then down the structure we have a directory. We can contain multiple files and multiple directories, and then we have the most smallest element, which is the content of a single file, and all of those artifacts are captured at a single visit, but are archived only one time, only a single time in Software Heritage without the duplication. For those artifacts, we have the IDO schema where we use the SHA-1 cryptographic hash for each artifact. And there are some examples that I present here, and when you'll have the slides, you can go and click and open each example and see how it looks in our web app. So we have the GPL license file identified with the first identifier, and then we have a directory. All are typed with the artifact type. So we have the directory, then the revision. Afterwards, we have a release, and the largest artifact is the entire snapshot that can contain a full development history in the snapshot. These identifiers can be resolved now on our website and also with N2T.org, also with identifiers.org. The identifiers can be resolved. And to end my presentation and to show you some nice features of the web application, I will go ahead to the web application on archive.softwareheritage.org. Here you have a list of all the repositories, the forges that we already have in our archive, and the current state of the archive, which is more than 89 million projects. Here you go to browse, and you can do a first search with a URL. So you get a repository URL that you can search directly here. But the new feature is the metadata feature. Instead of using the complete URL, you can search a name like Julien d'Anjou, which is a developer, a Python developer, and you check this box, and then when you click search, as I did before, you can go on the project where we found in the metadata inside the repository itself the name of this this author. So here you have the repository on our website. You have we are on a directory on this project. Then the reason we have the metadata, it was because we found it on this file, package.info, where author was is still Julien d'Anjou, and you can use and find the identifier to this file here on the permalink box, where you can have the identifier to the content itself, so to the package info, or to the revision, or to the snapshot, with or without the origin info, because we need it. Sometimes you need to know from where the artifact was captured. Another nice feature is that you can also do the same by selecting with a shift for couple of code lines. Here that there are no code, but the code lines in another file that could be a specific code. And then when you do use the content identifier, you can add selected lines, and at the end of the identifier you have the lines.
Kind of have
the line.
things we want to like we can take them down to see what's
can you please mute yourself?
Yeah. I mean,
it was just fun. I think it's
okay.
fun. And I think whatever comes out of our meeting,
Could you
this was useful or not?
Yeah, I will continue.
Okay, that makes sense.
Already now go and put your repository URL in this page, in the origin URL. You choose the origin type. If it's not a Git, you can have a Mercurial or a subversion, and you put your URL, and then you click OK. It's down here. So let's say, do I have something? Well, anyway, I don't have one. Even if I do anything, I submit the URL, and it becomes a request where I can go and see my request. I don't need to put any information, no my name, not my name, and anything else, just the URL. And we have a moderation process that accept URL that are whitelisted automatically, like from GitHub, or if it's not a known forge, we go and check the repository before it's whitelisted, and then it's a few hours later you can find it in the archive. So if your code isn't archived yet, you can always use the Save Code Now feature and make it available. So this is it for me. If you have any questions, I don't know how it works, but feel free to ask me.
Maureen, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, truly, like you provided some context earlier, but one question that might be useful context for everyone on the call is how long has it taken from the time that the Software Heritage team initially started building the infrastructure for the archive to the point at which the archive was made publicly accessible and searchable?
A long time.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what's long. Maybe it's not too long. The project was first initiated in 2016, and the browse page was only available last year. So and now the search mechanism is still very early in its early stages. Well, not every repository can be searched because we use, as I said, the intrinsic information inside the repository. So for now, we have only for Python and Java projects, ones that have specific files that we can mine to get this metadata. So there's still a long way to go. We're not and so that's the.
No, that's awesome. And both the metadata search feature outside of providing a specific URL and the save the code feature are both really exciting. I would invite everyone, if you have questions for Maureen, to go ahead and type them in the chat, or I've muted all of you just so Maureen could continue with her conversation. So you will need to potentially unmute yourself. If anyone has questions about that, again, just pop it into the chat and we'll make sure that your question gets back to Maureen. I had another one about the metadata feature, Maureen, which is,
yes.
So it makes perfect sense that in terms of the projects or the repos that can be searched, it's only the ones that you all know follow a particular like template in terms of how they, like the info file example that you showed. Like there are these key value pairs that you can that are reliably there, so you know that you can mine those. But are there, even in the projects for which you have a template that you can base that discovery feature on, are there any fields, do y'all vet the content in there? Have you run up against any instances?
No.
Okay. You can just, whatever, you can just look and then it will come up. Okay.
Well, it's an automatic indexer that is searching by a URL that he goes into the code and checks if a file exists with the certain name. So here the package info, and from this file it extracts and translates to our vocabulary, the vocabulary we are using, which is code meta, and while keeping all the metadata in a separate table. This is only possible for project or repositories that have these files. Projects that don't have the file, we don't have the information, and it's a lot of files, it's a lot of projects, so nobody goes and checks if it was true or false, because the fact is it was in the repository, so it may be a lie, but it's the lie that existed in the repository at the time that we search for this information.
Absolutely. Well, amazing. Thank you so much, Maureen. And again, Maureen has been really responsible for helping to develop this entire data model for software heritage. And she's an expert in this area and a wealth of information. So I would encourage you all to follow up if you have any questions. And if you do think of a question for the duration of the call for Maureen, or maybe some of her other team members at Software Heritage, please do pop it into the chat and we'll capture it. Thank you so much, Maureen. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jessica.
So Henry, would you like to take it away? So Henry is maintainer of, he's a software maintainer, longtime software maintainer of an open source project. It's a JavaScript compiler called Babel, which he'll talk more about today. But he is also a podcaster about maintenance with that specific lens of his experience as a software maintainer, but beyond that scope as well. And a community organizer in that sense, and a speaker. So we're very happy to have Henry here and tell us more about his work. Henry, go ahead.
All right, thanks, Jessica. I'm going to try to share my screen. I didn't do this beforehand, so I don't know if this is going to work.
I can see the notes, and then I can see the presentation on the right-hand side.
Okay, and then if I do play, does it show up?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, cool. So I kind of just made the slides like right before this, so I know I don't have that much time, so I'm going to probably go through it kind of fast. But yeah, thanks for letting me join. I feel like I'm an open source maintainer, but I don't think I've really thought about the preservation side of software. So I think it's really cool to have this opportunity to just talk. So yeah, I guess quick intro about me is that I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I moved to New York City about 3 years ago to work at Adobe as a web developer. And during that time, I kind of got more involved in open source. And so I'm going to talk about, so I work on this project called Babel. The website's babeljs.io. And we kind of briefly mentioned it's a JavaScript compiler and has a pretty wide usage in the industry. Just briefly, because I don't need to go into the technical details, but JavaScript's it's the most popular language. And also in terms of modules, NPM has the most. And it's funny because it's on Software Heritage as well. And so just briefly to talk about what it does, just so you have more context, it basically, when you have a programming language, you might add new syntax, new symbols and features, and browsers might not support them, especially old browsers. Like if they're still using Internet Explorer, then that doesn't automatically update, unlike like Chrome or Firefox. And so basically, this tool allows developers to write the new syntax, and it converts it by transforming into a backwards compatible version of JavaScript that is supported on browsers. So it's kind of an accessibility thing where it lets developers use the new shiny thing, but make sure that all the users that go to their website still are able to run their website, because otherwise it would just error. So basically, I left my job about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, to work on open source full time. And I didn't actually create Babel, and I could do a whole talk about how I got involved in open source. But basically, I kind of accidentally got involved, and I thought it was really cool. And I worked on it half time at work for a while, and then I kind of decided that it didn't seem like any company would support the work that I was doing full time. So I wanted to just see what would happen if I tried doing it on my own. So I kind of launched a Patreon and wrote a blog post about it. And honestly, a big reason why I decided to do this wasn't that I knew that it would be successful or anything, because there's not a lot of people doing this full time. But I felt like if I really wanted to kind of pursue what open source was about, that I think it would be best to do this, like kind of being able to just kind of give myself the mental space to think about it instead of thinking like all this time about other work that I was doing in my company. And so I kind of like forcing myself to have to think about it. Even though in the end, I realized that you have to think about a lot of other things too, and I'll get into that. But I don't regret the decision. So I'll talk a little briefly about crowdfunding, which is how I sustain myself now. A lot of open source developers, the way they fund themselves might be through donations, decide to make a whole company, and then they raise money. Right now, what we're doing is we're using this website or service called Open Collective. It's kind of like Kickstarter or Patreon, except it's for groups. And essentially, you can ask people or companies to pay or support us, and then everything is transparent. Like the Open Collective itself is open source, and you can see all the expenses and funding, where it's coming in and stuff like that. But yeah, it's really hard to actually get funding. I think a lot of people think that they can just make an Open Collective or Patreon and people just show up. But I realized, like, even the week that I quit, I already started talking to people. And then when I try to visit different cities, but maybe I can give a talk or go to a conference, I try to talk with people about how they can support us and we can support them. And so recently we've been having a lot more funding through companies. But in the end, it's a lot of work, and I think it's something that developers don't think a lot about because they're focused so much on just writing the code and kind of expecting people to just show up with money or show up with contributions. And another thing, so this is the context of this picture is that I was speaking at a conference and I wanted to eat lunch. So then my friend, like, I don't know why, found some chalk and wrote this tips for Babel thing at the conference, and people started donating money. So this is kind of a picture of what it feels like to fund open source at the moment, where you're kind of asking for like people to give you a few dollars here and there, when I think most maintainers that are working on projects that are infrastructure level that all these huge, billion-dollar companies rely on, they don't give any money back because they don't have to. And we're still like arguing over whether we can get $1 or not. And so the problem with donations and tips in some sense is that it kind of lowers your worth, because if a lot of developers decided to contract or do something different, they could probably charge a lot per hour, but instead they're kind of waiting for people to get the money. And maybe it feels bad that you're like okay with kind of demanding help from other people, because the whole point of open source is that you gave it away for free. But I kind of think about stuff like Twitch streams and YouTube, where people take tips and donations from users, and people like doing that, but they also take sponsorships. So I think in terms of funding open source, maybe we shouldn't think of things that are like kind of one size fits all, but like there are multiple approaches. So yeah, I made a Patreon. I make a pretty significant amount, like it seems like about 3,000 a month. It's not enough to live in New York or anything, but I think it's kind of one way where I don't feel like it's small enough where I'm gonna stop it. But it's also true that there's an article written in 2017 about how like only 2% of Patreon creators actually make more than minimum wage in the U.S. And I think it's really easy to get a lot of people to start one, but like, having a community or following, and like, it's a lot harder than just like waiting for people to show up. Yeah, another thing is interesting is that, people want to cry like social media notifications, but getting notifications for money can be kind of good and depressing at the same time. Like if you keep seeing like people deleting their pledges, it's really like, you might at first think, oh, it's not a big deal, but you might start thinking like, oh, did I do something wrong? Did I not update people enough? Am I doing the wrong kind of work? And sometimes it can be good and bad depending on like how you see that kind of validation. Um, and so thinking about validation, I think we kind of briefly touched about this before this talk, but I think it's kind of cool if we try to make more kind of support groups, or these kind of unconferences where people are talking to each other. And I feel like maintainers don't really talk to one another, especially even within its own language community, but then across languages or in different fields of whether it's in gaming or back end or front end development. I think it'd be good for people to share what they're going through. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about is this idea of like tiers and perks, especially on these crowdfunding platforms. They kind of ask you to, it lets people choose what kind of level they want to support you at. And a lot of times it's always some kind of thing where like, if you're an artist, then maybe you draw a picture for them if they spend like $100 a month. It kind of feels like a donation, but it's actually you're getting something in return. And I think, I'm not sure if that's the best way to go about doing this, because you're essentially just becoming a freelancer contractor with individuals, instead of and trying to put a price to things. And I think I want to see sponsors that donate individually, at least as just part of a relationship where we don't have to bribe them to continue to sponsor. And like, wouldn't it be okay if you could just support people and not expect anything back, just like how open source we give the code away and not expect anything either? And so I kind of changed my tiers list so that it's all things that have to do with like building a relationship or doing something in person. So I really like board games. So I decided like there's a game called Seven Wonders. And so I just arbitrarily decided $7 a month. Maybe you can play board games if we happen to be in the same city, or I like ping pong, or I like eating Korean barbecue, and attaching numbers to that. And so trying to make it more fun and more about myself rather than just like, here's like some code that I can help you review or write for you. And it gets into this question of like, why do we support people at all? And I think, when you find what people do are interesting, you want to support them in ways that go beyond just money. And so I think trying to build systems that help with that is really useful. And even in like, they ask you to do stuff like newsletters, like giving updates on how things are going. I think it's easy to kind of just get into a habit of just making a bunch of bullet lists on things you've done. But I think kind of thinking of it more of like sending a physical mail to a friend or something about your current thinking might be more helpful to get people to continue to want to encourage and support you than just simply that kind of rote list of what you're doing. And another thing I've been thinking about is promoting yourself. I don't really like doing that. I think a lot of people don't. Like, I don't want to spam people with mail or put all these ads on your website, or tweet out like, hey, you should support me, you should donate. And it's still uncomfortable, but I think it's kind of trying to figure out what you're okay with. And also realizing that everything that we do, especially online, is a signal of why you are important or whatever it is. And so it's kind of just good to think about that kind of perspective of like not having to see everything as selling, but also thinking in terms of relationship. Yeah, in terms of doing crowdfunding, it's interesting because whenever you're doing volunteer work, you're thinking about like how effective your hours are, and when you know that people are paying you, and you think about individuals, you might think that every second of your time has to be well spent. Unlike at a salary level where it's like, okay, I'm just doing work. I think it's important for developers and maintainers to think about like, how does rest and vacation fit in this paradigm of crowdfunding and just doing things on your own. It kind of feels like you feel like everyone's kind of watching you or micromanaging how you're doing things, but in reality, no one really cares, and people just kind of want to support what you're doing. So it's hard to feel like it's weird. Like you have the freedom to do whatever you want in a sense, but then you still kind of feel trapped because you have not even your own expectations, but what other people expect out of you as well. And this gets into like how you spend money too. Maybe you feel like because you are more aware of where money comes from rather than just from straight up just your company giving you a salary, that you feel like you have to spend it more wisely. But it's like, you know, how, are you able to spend money on like leisure as well? Or is it like, or you feel like everything has to be spent very efficiently? And I think this gets into this question of, what is open source culture? There's this sense where we want to give things away for free, but a lot of times the culture that we have created and are a part of, or we're not looking at it from the outside, is a reflection of just society in general. So, we have all of our notifications from social media and emails, and this notification thing on GitHub is not that different. You have thousands of notifications you have to go, and you feel like you have to go through all of them. We have inbox 0 for email, and now you have like notification 0 for the GitHub. And so this is a picture of my commit graph from GitHub from, let's see, 2012, 2017. And, in the beginning, you're not really doing open source, you get involved, and eventually you get kind of obsessed. And it's really easy to not catch yourself doing overwork. And I think this is a very big problem for maintainers in general, where they eventually will burn out. And another issue is like what success means in open source and in life in general, right? It seems like it's a lot about numbers. Like we have a lot of, repos that depend on Babel, and we have lots of downloads, $17 million a month, and lots of stars. But in the end, like, do those really matter? Are we trying to optimize for them, or optimizing for like the health of a project in a community? Because in a sense, the more successful you are in open source, you get more feedback, you get more bugs, you get more issues, not necessarily more help in terms of people or funding. And I think it's important for us to think about how maintainers are going to sustain their work for the long term. Another issue that we have is this herd mentality of like, and usually negative, of when people start doing +1s, they'll do a bunch of +1s. When they kind of, something seems to not be, like if you deprecate something, people get mad. If you put in a message to ask for money, then people might get mad as well. So there's a lot of problems with that. And also instant expectations. This is like a Slack conversation I had with someone where they joined our chat room, but then they just immediately pasted in an error message expecting that, maybe the maintainer should know exactly what we're supposed to do. And I think as things get faster, people expect not just like websites and services to be faster, but people as well. I think it's a matter of people not really understanding who's behind things. And so in a sense, that's why like it's cool that no one has to know who's working on it. But then when you think about the problems that show up because of infrastructure, it is important to know who's working on these things. And this is a problem in any service industry, whether you work at a restaurant or doing calls. People expect a lot out of what they're getting, even though, and it's weird because the cheaper it is, or especially with open source when it's free, people don't really treat maintainers that well. Don't really need to go into that, but I think one of the problems is that actually that I kind of feel like open source is a mirror, just like life. In a way, it's not just other people treating you bad, but you kind of might pick up on that and respond negatively as well. And I think it's important to kind of catch ourselves to think, what are we reflecting and what values do we have? I keep using this from The Dark Knight. I'm talking about how it's easy to see yourself as the hero, and you're like, I'm trying to save people and like serve the community and give things away for free, but you might find yourself over time becoming jaded. And I think it's important to kind of see that in yourself.
Henry,
Mhm.
Yeah, this is awesome. I want to thank you so much. I just so we have time, like looking at the time for Robert to talk a little bit about his work.
Yeah.
What I'm gonna ask, if it's okay with you, because there are a few specific things that I know this has been really incredible. There's a lot of things I'd like to say that would tie this to a lot of open infrastructure initiatives within scholarly communications and beyond, as it relates to open source and just open access in general. I think there are so many parallels here, and I think that a lot of the points that you have made just in the past few minutes around instant expectations, invisibility, the way that labor is valued, these are all conversations that people are deeply entrenched in terms of cultural heritage discourse as we speak. So I think there are some, if we could continue this conversation, I think that would be great. I have some questions I think that that folks might be interested in. There are a couple of other initiatives that you work on. So I wanted to give you a chance to give a quick plug for for your podcast, and then we'll hand it over to Robert.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize it took so long. So yeah, thinking about, different ways of engaging this kind of thought. One thing I did was create this podcast back in October last year called Hope in Source. And I did it with my friend Nadia, who used to work at GitHub. And I just realized, as someone, someone in faith, I realized that a lot of the things I do there is pretty similar to open source. And so we made like 10 episodes. It's on like iTunes and Spotify and all that, about how they're related. So simple example of like being in community, being intrinsically motivated, thinking about evangelism for your project, for people getting involved, thinking about money, and just trusting people on there that you might not know. And so we did like 10 episodes on that and just interviewed our first guest. And then also recently I've been working on another podcast because I suddenly got into podcasts called Maintainers Anonymous. And that kind of speaks to this idea of being invisible, where a lot of maintainers, whether it's, I think in another way that everyone is a maintainer. We all try to take care of something, whether it's code or, our community or our apartment or being parents, infrastructure. And so I try to talk to different people on that. And I also interviewed Wendy, who's on librarian at Georgia Tech. And then recently I've been trying to get into more reading. I think these are 3 different interesting authors thinking about just ideas on how to sustain communities and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that's.
And Henry, would you be willing to share the link to, and Moraine, this question is for you also, would y'all be willing to share the links to your presentations?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Henry. That was amazing and much appreciated. Yeah. If people pop any questions into the chat or the meeting notes doc, we will have to circle back around with both you and Moraine, and probably with Robert too. So stay tuned. Yeah, and then so our last speaker today, and I think we'll probably run out of time. We want to give Robert a chance, so I'll do a quick preview for network reports. I think Ewan Cochran is online from the EASY program of work, as well as Ethan Gates. And so there are some updates that have been written out at the bottom here for the EASY update, and you can also check out the full EASY update from Seth Anderson, the program manager for the EASY program of work, in the last stack trace, which we can link to, and maybe if it's available for Hannah, she can pop it into the chat, because we have extensive updates from both the Fostering Communities of Practice and the EASY program of work in the latest stack trace, which just came out last week. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Robert. Hold on, Robert. We can't hear you. Let me find you. Oh, there you are. You're unmuted. Okay.
All right. There, now you should be able to see me.
Yep, we can.
So yeah, I'm Robert. I'm a student at the UVA in Amsterdam. I've been working together with a whole bunch of people on the actually digging up and preserving of the Amsterdam digital city. So to give you guys some context there, back in 1996, internet started to become a thing in the Netherlands. We were a bit late on the uptake, but people actually needed to have some sort of interface for the internet. So the first website was the Digital City, in Dutch, of course. And on its second anniversary, they actually made a backup with the idea to preserve it for future generations. And that backup was stored away, got in a locker, and no one ever looked at it again until a few years ago, when someone actually came up with like, hey, the anniversary is coming up, we should do something with this. So they went to the university and got some actual students involved of computer science to actually like, hey, we have this backup on actual magnetic tape. How can we actually do something with this? So a bunch of students started to actually like figure out, all right, how can we actually get the data out of this? Start reading it, transferring it, and 1 year later, they had it all up on the server, and some people actually started to get some code up and running again from the actual digital city. And then I got involved. In my year, they just took all the students of a course called History of Digital Cultures, so just a bunch of computer science students. And they said, well, here we have this enormous pile of data, an actual backup of the system. Just see what you can do with it. Just do history. So me and my team, we were looking into how do actual communities form on the internet and in the early internet, because we had access to emails, chat messages, news groups. But the more we actually started to look into it and actually saw the scope of the data, it being a complete system backup, we kind of got to thinking like, can't we just bring this entire thing up and running again? Famous last words. But we actually attempted that and we got pretty close. We had to extend the project, but we actually managed to transfer a lot of the files, get them up and running again, and make a working prototype of the web interface. So this is old Netscape, looking around, more web pages that are very small because data was expensive. And that actually got me into researching and writing about digital preservation. So the idea of several strategies that comes to, all right, what are actual practical approaches? Because there are always problems when you have source code. Then to actually transfer it to working code, because you need libraries, you need an actual system to run it. And then I started to really read up on, all right, how can we actually not only preserve the code, so the bits and bytes, but also the functioning system? And really the answer we came up with, that in the best case scenario, you would have the working computer, but those break down. So the next best thing is to actually put everything in virtual machines. So actually virtualize it, make sure that you have some sort of viewer that you can run it in. And that way you can send over the entire working machine and get it working on, and theoretically, any system. So that was kind of how I got introduced into digital preservation. At the moment, I've gone along with a new project still related to DDS data, but I'm actually looking into the time-related metadata that came along with it. Because when you have files, you also have along a lot of extra data, of course, including when a file was accessed, when a file was modified, or when its metadata were changed. But for a lot of people, these type of data are not easily accessible. especially when you take it onto a higher level for an entire system. You might have seen this when you're just browsing files in your own computer. You usually have this little tablet interface in your viewer or your file explorer. And you can see like, hey, this file was last modified on this date. Well, I'm currently writing a program that actually extracts all that information, that you can graph it and actually use it to tell something about the system that you're studying. So if you have this metadata available, then you can actually look like, hey, this is the time a lot of files were last modified. So that can have some implications. In the case of modification being that, all right, this was the last time it was modified, so development on it stopped. So in the case of a backup, you would expect everything to stop at the moment of the backup. It's also a quick sanity check just because, well, if files are changed after the backup was made, that means your backup is somehow corrupted. So yeah, that's currently what I'm working on, and I'm hoping to present a working version of that soon.
That's very cool, Robert. I'll take this opportunity since we're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. That's a great overview. I linked to one of your papers on the digital city, but it would be great if you could, do you have a write-up about your time-based metadata that you're currently doing? Is there a resource online or like your personal website where people would be able to go once you went, or your GitHub account or whatever platform that you use to share your code, where people could go once it's live?
At the moment, I have a little proposal up in Google Drive, but I'm still looking into actually getting an online presence. At the moment, it's all schoolwork, but yeah, expect a GitHub to show up in the near future.
Very good. Well, you'll have to keep us apprised of when the script is ready.
Yeah.
Because I think it would be interesting to see how this time-based metadata visualization that is the result of your script maps to some of the work and the scripts that are included in, say, like the Big Curator environment, where they're looking at like a corpus of born digital data and trying to make observations about what that could possibly mean for the purposes of describing it at least the level to which people could determine whether or not they want to go deeper or request access. So I think there's probably a lot of interest in looking at those two things side by side. So yeah, you'll have to let us know. Oh, there's Robert's proposal. So let me capture that, and I will put that into the meeting notes document. Given that we are at 59, I want to say a huge and warm welcome to all three of our esteemed guests today, Moraine, Henry, and Robert, for taking the time to share their work. I think it's all really fascinating, and we could have gone into more extensive detail in Q&A with each one of them. So what I might do as a follow-on to this, again, if you have questions about anything you heard today, please do let us know or reach out to any one of them individually with whatever contact information is provided, and I'll double check that they're comfortable with me sharing their email for you to follow up via email. And then we'll make sure to get links to their presentations. So when the recording is ready, we might just send it out on the list along with those links to the presentations, and also make sure that that is shared in the next Stack Trace. So with that, I just want to say thanks to all of you for attending today. And I hope you have a beautiful rest of your week, and we will act on your suggestions for future speakers and topics. Thanks so much.